Emily sat drenched on a wooden bench in the center of a glittering garden. Her violin clutched against her chest like a shield. Rain poured without mercy, soaking her pale blue dress until it clung to her frame. While a crowd of wealthy guests huddled under black umbrellas and laughed, their voices carried sharp as knives. Some called her a maid. Others joked she must have slipped in from the kitchen. They mocked her trembling hands, her thrift store dress, the battered violin that looked older than she was. She didn't rise to their taunts. She didn't defend herself. Her silence only made them bolder. A man in a tuxedo raised his glass and asked loudly who had let her in. Another, with diamonds at her ears, smirked and said the instrument probably cost less than her shoes. The laughter swelled, bouncing across the manicured hedges, feeding on itself until it was almost louder than the storm. Emily's chin dipped slightly, her wet hair sliding forward. But she didn't break. She only held the violin tighter, her lips pressed thin. Then came the shift. Heavy footsteps across the grass. A large black umbrella opened above her, blocking the storm. The billionaire host, Alexander Grant, stepped into the circle of scorn without a word. His coat slid from his shoulders and settled over hers, heavy with warmth against her soaked dress. He turned to face the crowd, his voice clear and sharp. If she is not worthy, then no one here is. The garden froze. Laughter stopped mid-breath. The air itself seemed to hold still. That moment would replay across millions of screens by morning, but to understand why she sat alone in the rain, mocked for daring to play, and how a single note changed everything. We need to go back to the morning call that broke her, the invitation that lured her, and the dream she refused to bury. This story begins long before the umbrella opened. Emily had once been called a prodigy. At 15, she could fill a room with music that felt bigger than her body. But her family never saw it that way. They called it a distraction, a waste of her name, a hobby that would never build the life they expected. The violin that felt like breath to her was the very thing that turned her mother's face cold and made her father shake his head in silence. By the time she was 20, she was practicing only in secret, notes muffled against pillows, never daring to invite them to listen. On the morning of the charity event, her phone rang at 0715, her sister's number glowing across the cracked screen. The words came sharp before Emily could even say hello. "You are embarrassing us." Playing for strangers like some street act, our family built legacies, not little concerts. The call ended with the click of dismissal. Emily stared at the phone for a moment, her heart pounding against her ribs, then set it face down on the table. She wiped her eyes quickly. As if doing so might erase the words, she still dressed carefully, sliding into a pale blue dress that was simple but neat. Pressing the fabric with a small iron she kept tucked away. Her violin case was old, corners worn smooth, but she polished the wood until it caught a soft glow in the dim light. By 0930, she was on the bus toward the estate. Sitting quietly with her case balanced on her knees, other passengers barely glanced her way. She rehearsed finger positions against her thigh, whispering the names of the notes under her breath, as if repeating a prayer. The mansion loomed high on the hill, its drive lined with expensive cars, gleaming under a light drizzle. Guests stepped out with practiced grace, their gowns and tuxedos protected by umbrellas held by staff. Emily walked past them, carrying her violin against her chest. No one offered her cover. She entered through the side gate, directed there by a guard who barely looked at her, and found herself in the garden where the performance would take place. Clusters of guests gathered under canopies, sipping wine before noon, their voices carrying with easy confidence. One woman in a gold dress tilted her chin and whispered loudly enough to be heard, noting that Emily looked like she belonged in the kitchen more than on stage. A man beside her laughed, the kind of laugh meant to sting. Nearby, an influencer adjusted her phone stand, rehearsing lines into the camera with a mocking smile. She told her followers to stay tuned for a spectacle, promising them they wouldn't believe who thought she belonged at the main event. Emily found a wooden bench near the center, uncovered, its surface slick with rain. She sat carefully, smoothing her dress as if that small gesture might hide the damp patches already spreading across the fabric. She rested the violin against her lap and kept her eyes lowered. Around her, the crowd moved in waves of chatter and laughter, their umbrellas bumping together, their perfume thick in the wet air. She was alone among them, invisible, except for the moments when someone decided to point and laugh. For Emily, it was supposed to be a chance. She thought she had been invited to play a few songs for charity, maybe even connect with someone who believed in her music. Instead, she felt like prey caught in a ring of predators. Every glance, a fresh cut. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the bow, but she forced herself to breathe evenly. She had been told all her life that dreams were foolish. She had been told again that very morning. Yet she had come anyway, because a part of her still believed that the sound of her violin might change something. Emily sat on the wet bench with her violin across her lap, and the crowd seemed to close in on her. A woman in a glittering red gown leaned closer to her companion and asked if the maid had gotten lost on the way to the kitchen. Laughter rippled outward, bouncing from one cluster to another, each voice adding weight to the cruelty. Emily kept her gaze low, her fingers pressed against the smooth wood of the violin as if anchoring herself. Another guest pointed openly, noting the scratches along the violin's body. He said it looked like something rescued from a pawn shop, and the people around him laughed, as if he had told the cleverest joke of the afternoon. The influencer, dressed in sleek, black, lifted her phone and went live. She whispered to her viewers that they were about to watch a charity case embarrass herself. Zooming in on Emily's soaked dress and trembling hands, comments streamed across her screen, filled with mocking words and laughing faces. A man with cufflinks, shaped like crowns, asked loudly why she was sitting among the guests instead of serving them. His voice carried enough that heads turned, eyes settling on her with judgment. Emily's cheeks flushed hot under the cold rain. But she did not answer. She only shifted her grip on the bow, her knuckles pale as her nails pressed into her palm. The silence she held seemed to invite more ridicule, as if her refusal to respond made her an easier target. The laughter grew bold, echoing against the hedges, as if the garden itself joined in. They called her a nobody, a girl out of place, someone too small to matter. Yet Emily did not move. She sat steady, the violin close to her chest, her body tense but unbroken. Every cruel word cut deeper. Every mocking glance burned hotter. And still she refused to give them what they wanted. She stayed silent, a lone figure in the storm, her quiet dignity standing in sharp contrast to the noise around her. Emily lifted the bow with hands that still trembled, the wood slick with rain. For a moment the garden buzzed with laughter. But when the first note rang out, it was sharp and clear, a sound that cut straight through the storm. The vibration carried over the umbrellas, echoing across the hedges, steady and unbroken. The mockery faltered, voices fading as if pulled back by the force of that single sound. Her eyes closed, lashes wet, and she drew the bow again, this time smoother, fuller, letting the melody swell. The strings responded with a voice that was rich and aching, the kind of sound that made chests tighten even when people wanted to keep laughing. The old musician near the back froze with his glass halfway to his lips, his breath catching. He whispered to the woman beside him that this was no amateur, no servant trying to play. This was trained, this was real. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, their smiles uncertain as the music climbed. A man muttered that it was still nothing more than noise from a girl who didn't belong, but his words sounded thinner now, weaker against the strength of the violin. Another guest forced a laugh, calling it a street corner trick, but no one echoed him this time. Emily's bow moved faster, the rhythm growing bold. defiant, her soaked dress clinging to her as if the rain itself leaned in to listen. The storm had not lessened, but the air felt changed. Each note landed with precision, each pause heavy enough to draw silence from the crowd. For the first time all night, Emily was not invisible. She was undeniable. Her music standing taller than the laughter, louder than the scorn. She had come to play, and nothing could stop her now. Rain fell harder, drumming against the umbrellas like 1,000 impatient fingers. But Emily's music only grew stronger, her bow carved through the storm, each note slicing clean against the roar of water and the low hum of discontent. Some guests still whispered insults, their voices sharp with pride. But the sound of the violin climbed higher, steady and relentless. The air seemed to shift with her playing, as if the storm itself leaned in to listen. Near the front, a little girl peeked from beneath her mother's umbrella, her wide eyes fixed on Emily. She tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered softly that it was beautiful. The words were small, almost lost in the downpour, yet they reached a few who stood close. An older man with silver hair heard the child and lowered his glass, his gaze steady on Emily. His face trembled as tears mixed with the rain, his memory catching the truth in every note. He had heard this sound before, years ago, when a young prodigy vanished from the stage. Still, not everyone surrendered. A man in a navy suit barked that she was just poor, that music could not change who she was. Another woman crossed her arms, hissing that by tomorrow she would crawl back to her tiny apartment. Their words rang hollow against the melody that refused to break. The rhythm surged, filling the garden with a raw power no one could deny. Phones that once recorded mockery now shook in unsteady hands as lenses tried to capture what was unfolding. The tension reached a breaking point when a guard stepped forward, boots splashing in the puddles. Another followed, closing in as the host gave a curt nod for them to remove her. Emily never paused, her bow pressed harder, her music louder than the order meant to silence her. Just as the guards reached for her arm, a large black umbrella opened above her. The storm cut off in a single shadow. Alexander Grant, tall and calm, placed himself between Emily and the crowd. His coat slid from his shoulders and wrapped around hers, heavy with warmth, and he spoke words that carried like thunder. If she is not worthy, then no one here is. The entire garden fell still. The laughter choked into silence, and every mocking face froze in place. Even the rain seemed to hesitate, each drop striking softer, as if the storm itself was stunned. Emily's bow lingered on one last aching note, her head bowed, her music and his words bound together in a moment no one would forget. By the next morning, the garden was no longer the story. The image of Emily, soaked in her pale blue dress with a violin pressed to her chest and a coat draped across her shoulders, had already spread across every platform. Clips of her playing in the rain racked up millions of views overnight. Headlines asked who she was, calling her the girl who silenced a crowd with music. Comment sections overflowed with praise, disbelief, and anger at the people who had mocked her. For those guests, the fallout came quickly. The businessman who barked for her removal was recognized within hours, his outburst replayed in slow motion online. By noon, his firm announced he was leaving under pressure, his name trending for all the wrong reasons. The woman in the red gown found her latest sponsorship canceled, her face plastered across screenshots sneering at Emily. The influencer who live-streamed the mockery deleted the video, but the internet never forgets. Screenshots were everywhere, her followers turning on her with comments that cut deeper than she had ever imagined. There was a strange sense of justice in how it unfolded. The laughter that once echoed across the hedges now replayed as evidence of cruelty. Strangers online identified the guests one by one, attaching names, jobs, and reputations to every smirk and cruel word. Some issued apologies written in polished statements. Others vanished from public view, But the damage was done. Each clip replayed with captions, pointing out how the same people who laughed had been silenced when the music rose. Emily herself stayed quiet. She returned to her small apartment and closed the door. She did not scroll through the comments or watch the videos. Yet outside, the world could not stop replaying her defiance. People shared her image with captions calling her strength, calling her grace, calling her worthy. The story reached newsrooms, late-night talk shows, and community pages across the country. Everyone wanted to know who the girl in the rain was. For once, it was not the wealthy or the powerful setting the tone. It was the millions watching from phones and screens, moved by a moment that felt raw and real. They saw a young woman stand against humiliation without raising her voice. And they felt something shift. The people who had sneered now faced consequences, while Emily, silent and soaked, became the center of a storm she never asked for. Long before the garden, Emily had been known to a small circle as a prodigy. At 14, she had stunned judges in a national competition. Her name printed in programs beside musicians twice her age, but her family dismissed it as a childish phase. They told her to put the violin away and focus on what they called a proper future. The weight of their rejection silenced her for years, forcing her to play only in private, carrying the gift quietly like a secret. The night of the rain changed that. Among the crowd stood an old musician who once shared a stage with her. He recognized the precision of her bow, the phrasing that no casual player could master. Days later, he wrote an article in a respected journal calling her the vanished prodigy. His words spread quickly, retelling the story of a girl who disappeared when she should have risen. A girl who had finally returned when no one expected it. For the first time in years, Emily's name was spoken with reverence. Alexander Grant, the billionaire whose umbrella had shielded her, took the recognition further. At a press conference held at 10000, he announced her appointment as director of his Global Arts Foundation. The world watched as the girl mocked in the rain was now given the authority to shape programs for young musicians across continents. Reporters called it redemption. But Emily did not speak of redemption. She simply stood with quiet composure. The coat that had once covered her shoulders, replaced by a title that carried weight. It was more than an honor. It was recognition that her music had always been real, even when her own family refused to see it. What had been called a waste was now framed as vision. What had been ignored was now celebrated. Emily had endured silence and scorn. Yet her talent had waited for its moment. When it came, the world could not look away. The foundation began with a simple mission. Emily wanted doors open for the children who carried talent but lacked resources. For the young musicians who had been told to give up before they even had a chance. Grants were created for schools where instruments were scarce. Workshops appeared in community centers, where music had long been silent. She poured her energy into making sure no child sat in the rain believing they were unworthy. The first concert held under the foundation's name was not in a grand hall. It was staged in a community auditorium at 0630 on a Saturday evening, filled with families who had never been invited to such an event. The seats were plain, the lighting modest, but the air carried a quiet excitement. Children in borrowed clothes clutched violins, cellos, and guitars, their faces shining with nervous pride. Emily stood at the side, not on stage, watching them step into the light she once feared she would never find again. In the front row sat the little girl who had whispered through the storm that night. Her hair was tied neatly, her dress simple, her eyes wide with joy. She leaned forward, clapping before the music even began. Her voice too soft to carry, but her smile bright enough to light the room. Emily caught her gaze and nodded gently. A silent acknowledgement that this was her moment too. That small gesture bridged the distance between stage and audience, reminding everyone present that inspiration could last long after a single night. The music filled the hall with a mix of hesitation and courage. Every note imperfect, yet alive. Parents wiped tears as they watched their children play. Teachers whispered to one another that this was only the beginning. Emily did not need applause or headlines. The sound of those young voices rising together was more than enough. She saw in them what had been denied to her for so long, the chance to be believed in. Her legacy was not built on one viral video or one night in the rain. It was built on every child who now had a stage, every hand that dared to lift a bow, every voice that chose not to be silent. Emily had turned her humiliation into a foundation of hope. And in that hall, surrounded by music that was raw and real, she proved that worth was never something granted by the powerful. It was something carried within and shared, one song at a time.